Hello, hello, hello. We're about ready to start. Uh, I have two things to mention to you before she gives her lecture. One is you should find some 3x5 cards on your table. And if you, during the lecture, if you think of questions that you would like to ask Dr. Banks, please write them out and we'll come by and collect them and give them to her at the end of her lecture. And the other thing is that the lecture is being recorded. And so you will be able to hear the lecture and see the lecture later on through the St. Peter's website. And I think with that, we'll let Dr. Banks take over.
Is that, there we go. Let me get the spacing right. Is that too loud? That's good. Okay. I had one person who was concerned about the hearing. Is that a thumbs up? It's good. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for listening ahead of time. And I hope that dinner was delicious. It certainly smelt and looked it. So thanks to the chef. And thank you to everyone. Yeah. Go Viewpoint. So today I'm going to be talking about Alzheimer's disease. The title is Alzheimer's in Women, but I will mention men, of course, as well. And I'll explain why I'm going to focus on women as well. So I'm not here alone tonight. I'm here with my colleague, Ella Lifset. Ella is a coordinator for one of our projects and a wonderful young scientist who's going to get nabbed by medical school any day now. So we're keeping her around as long as we possibly can. So these are the questions that I'm going to try to answer today. And I'm appreciating all of your questions as well so that I can fill in some gaps. But I'm going to start by just kind of defining Alzheimer's disease and dementia and some of these terms that we throw around, make sure everyone's on the same page. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it affects women differently than men. We all want to know how we can reduce our risk, and the science there has got really exciting, so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at UC San Diego to study Alzheimer's disease in women. So to start with some terminology about sex differences and gender, so just to give everyone the same kind of hymn book. So when I'm talking about sex, I'm talking about biological distinction of males versus females. So that's often the sex you're defined at birth. Sometimes we're talking about chromosomal sex. And for the most part, it's binary. There's differences there, but for the most part, it's one or the other. And then gender is a slightly more complicated psychosocial construct, talking about how we identify ourselves, which very much is influenced by social and cultural factors, and also time. So what happened to women and men who are now 80 or 90 might be different to what's happening to women and men who are in Ella's generation, who are a lot younger. So gender has a bit more of a fluid connotation. So really important terminology is dementia versus Alzheimer's disease. So some people think of those two things as one and the same, but they're not quite. So when we talk about dementia, it's really kind of an umbrella term, a very general term that talks about the progressive loss of memory, language, problem solving, and other thinking abilities that are severe enough by the time you have dementia to really interfere with your daily life. And how we measure daily life when someone comes into a clinic is someone able to pay the bills on time? Is someone able to manage their medications without help? Things like that. Can they get the shopping? And all of these things, it's kind of subtle early in the dementia process, but eventually people can't do those things by themselves or make meals and things like that. So dementia, that progressive loss of ability, is caused by different diseases in the brain. The most common is Alzheimer's disease, but there's a lot of other diseases as well that you've probably heard of. Lewy body disease, like Robin Williams had, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia. So Bruce Willis has that. And a lot of people will have a mixture of those things. So mixed pathology is actually very common. But Alzheimer's is the most common sort of one-cause dementia. And about 7 million Americans aged 65 or older live with Alzheimer's disease dementia. So it's really common. Most of us, all of us probably know someone who's had Alzheimer's disease. And it's, as we were discussing earlier, it's really affects a whole family. It doesn't just affect the one person who's got the diagnosis. So what happens in the brain during Alzheimer's disease? So sometimes I'll use the term AD, that means Alzheimer's disease. I'll try not to use too many other acronyms. So there's two main pathologies or diseases that cause Alzheimer's disease. One is amyloid plaques. And so you can see, on the picture over there, you can see two different kinds of changes. One is amyloid plaques, and these are sticky accumulations that happen between the cells of the brain. And those spread throughout the brain 10 to 15 years before we see memory loss and cognitive breakdown. And so they're there, but they're not really causing that much problem until, for some reason, and we don't know why, they trigger the spread of something called tau tangles. And tau is a different kind of protein that misfolds, so it gets these tangles that accumulate inside the brain cells. And because they accumulate inside the brain cell, they stop it from functioning properly. So Alzheimer's disease, kind of by definition now, is the combination of amyloid and then tau. But tau is like the evil little brother that comes along and causes all the problems. Amyloid, you could live and die with a bunch of amyloid in your brain, and if you don't have the tau, you might be just fine. You wouldn't necessarily know anything about it. After the tau has got inside the brain cells, it eventually kills them, and then we see shrinkage of the brain tissue. So in this picture, you see one half, that's a healthy half of the brain. It's nice and plump and full. That's how we'd all like our brains to look. And on the other side, it's kind of shrunken and shriveled, and that's eventually what happens with Alzheimer's disease. But it doesn't happen in one go. It happens in a very specific order for the most part. So tau, that problematic part of the disease process, starts even in people in their 40s and 50s. You know, if someone like me would run over and had a brain autopsy, you might see some tau in my locus ceruleus and around my entorhinal cortex, which are two bits of the brain right down deep inside. And thankfully, at this point, I don't think they're causing too much trouble if they are there. But if I live for another 10 or 15 years and then amyloid starts spreading around, and then we give my brain another 10 or 15 years to start accumulating tau, I might look like I'm in the middle there, where the tau has spread a little bit into parts of the brain that are really important for making new memories, maybe for finding the right word, maybe for a little bit of multitasking. And at that point, I might get something called a diagnosis of something called mild cognitive impairment, which is when you have some cognitive or thinking difficulties, but you're still independent. You're still paying your bills on time. You're still getting your medications, your meals, all of those things. It's just harder. If that continues to spread and progress, that's when the tau is all over the brain, and that's when we get the dementia and the real sort of lack of independence, and that can progress through to the end of life. So tau is of particular interest to me and to people who are interested in cognition. How can we measure this stuff during life? So the picture in brown there is a slide from a slice of someone's brain that's been collected after life, which shows that the amyloid plaque, big sticky mess, and the neurofibrillary tangle, which is attacked a brain cell. And one of the things that's happened within my career is the ability to use brain imaging, so PET scans, to actually look at amyloid and tau during life. So when I was in graduate school, which wasn't that long ago, a couple of decades. We had to wait really to get a solid diagnosis until somebody was dead and donated their brain, and they had an autopsy and bloody blah. It was quite complicated. But now we can actually put people in the scanner, we inject something that sticks to the amyloid or the tau in their brain, and we can take pictures and see if someone has it. Another way of doing it is removing some of the cerebrospinal fluid using a lumbar puncture process where we put a tiny needle and take out some of the fluid that circulates around the spine and the brain. And in that we can see those proteins, but we don't know quite where they are, of course. And now, even more exciting, just in the last few years, we actually have blood tests which can tell pretty accurately whether or not someone has amyloid in their brain. The tau ones are still in development, but give it a couple of years. The technology is really mind-blowing how quickly this is happening. Because we're all getting older, like the Americans are getting older, thankfully, age is the #1 risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So when we combine the population getting older, so the bit in purple there is the population over 85, the bit in orange is 75 to 84. Those parts of the population are predicted to grow over time. And whereas that's wonderful news, it also means that we are going to be seeing more and more people who live long enough to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, unless we do something about it. And as you all know, once someone has Alzheimer's disease, it's a terrible process for them and their families. It's also very, very costly. So they can't live independently anymore. They might need to go to eventually to independent living facility or some other help. All of these things cost a lot of money. So from a kind of social policy making standpoint as well, we need to do something about this. We can't really afford to have dementia be as common as as it's going to be. And of course, none of us want that. So just a little bit more of the sort of background on dementia and what it means. This is the sort of the course of dementia. So over the years, we know now that people go through this long process that we call the preclinical phase. And this is when somebody has amyloid pathology in their brain for 10 to 15 years, no cognitive symptoms, doesn't interfere with their daily life. And that can be a very long period. And because we can now detect that gives us a really, really great opportunity to intervene. Because we can say, okay, if we leave you alone long enough, you're going to progress to dementia. But what if we could intervene now and do something exciting to prevent that? Mild cognitive impairment is that next stage where people have enough tau to start causing problems, but they're independent. And then eventually we get to the point of dementia. So this is the normal course of or trajectory of the disease. And it separates from normal aging. So dementia is not a normal part of aging. It is different. Some people think that if we live to 120, 130, or 140, we would all get Alzheimer's disease, and that's a theory. But for the most part, most people or a lot of people will not get dementia, even if they live into their 90s, thankfully. So why the focus on women? Well, women represent about 2/3 of cases of Alzheimer's disease in this country. And of course, a part of that is because women tend to live longer and age is such a big risk factor, but it's not the only reason. So even if we control for age, we do find that women have more vulnerability for Alzheimer's disease than men. And we are trying to figure out why, and we've got a few clues. So one is that women and men have different brains. And these are some of the very scientific ways that they differ. And then these are some of the more boring ways that they differ. So women and men actually have, on average, different shapes to their brains. So the pink regions there are areas that are bigger in women, and the blue areas are areas that are bigger in men. So women and men have adapted to have slightly different brains, and women's brains, it might not surprise anyone, the left and the right hemisphere tend to communicate a little bit better. But there are differences, and we could go into the details, but we don't have time. But one difference is that when women do start depositing that tau, something happens which differentiates the sort of course of the disease for men and women. where men have a nice linear trajectory of tau deposition, but women have what I call the tau inferno, where during that mild cognitive impairment phase, women have this big bump in tau that men don't have. And this was a study we did looking at a bunch of those tau PET scans. And the yellow areas are the areas with more tau. And these are men and women who are kind of equal on age and other factors. But the women have a lot more tau in their brain, more yellow than the men, where it's a lighter color. And I see that as this great opportunity. If we can figure out why women get that burst of tau, maybe we can stop the tau spreading, and that would help men and women. Another difference is that women are diagnosed later because our brains work differently. So something that we know is that women throughout life, from childhood, do better on verbal tests involving words like remembering word lists, remembering stories, things like that, than do boys and men. We don't really take that into account in medicine when we screen for dementia. So if you go and for your Medicare wellness visit, your annual visit with your doctor, they might give you a little test to see how your memory is. And Donald Trump likes to tell everyone that he got full points on this test, but it's heavily biased towards words. So there's a lot of, they don't test memory using shapes, or it's harder to test memory without words. But when we test memory with words, women do better. And if you look at this little graph and you follow the women's line and the men's line, what we see is that women need to have more tau in their brain, if we think about the line as the amount of tau on the bottom, than do men to get to the same point on that test. So by the time we detect Alzheimer's disease in women, the disease tends to be further along than it is in men. So that's not a great thing if we're trying to stop it in its tracks. This is a study. A couple of people asked me about medications, and something that's happened that's very exciting in the last couple of years is we now have FDA-approved medications to slow down the disease. And they do that by removing the amyloid pathology. The studies that they've used so far have been based on that MCI and early dementia phase of the disease. So not the preclinical, very early phase, but once someone already has symptoms. And Eisai is the company who make lecanemab, which is one of the medications that is being prescribed now. And they, good on them, they did share the sex differentiated data, which is what I'm showing you here. And I won't spend too long on this slide, there's a lot going on. But this is called a forest plot. And basically it's two different outcome measures. This is one of the ADAS-Cog is all cognitive, and the ADCS, MCI-ADL looks at the combination of cognition and activities of daily living. And they look in the purple there, you see women at the top and men at the bottom. And if the horizontal line touches the vertical line, that actually means that the results are not significant. And so although as a whole, the data here was significant and the drug got FDA approved, when they looked just in women and just in men, the men did a lot better than the women did. And I suspect that's because the women were further along in the disease process. But this is one of the reasons why it's really important, I think, not to ignore sex and to look at how we design these studies and how we look at the results to make sure that we're really getting medications and studying medications in a way that works for both men and women. There's a newer medication, donanemab, where instead of looking at cognition to bring the patients into the study, they looked at the amount of tau in the brain, and in that situation, the women actually did slightly better than the men. So the way we study brains is important, and I personally think that sex matters. So now for some really good news. So something else that's happened in the last few years in Alzheimer's disease research that's really exciting is we have figured out that there is a huge amount of modifiable risk. And the latest study that was based on data from the UK and the US and sort of English-speaking countries suggests that at least 45% of dementia cases could be prevented by addressing lifestyle. What do I mean by lifestyle? Well, this is a the authors of this study published their data in the Lancet, and they're called the Lancet Commission. And the Lancet Commission took a bunch of different studies that they drilled down and looked at the evidence. So how good is the evidence for cholesterol, for example, to be as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease? And the things where there was really clear evidence got into this model. And they broke it down by early life. So having less education is a risk factor. And that means, leaving school before you finish high school, having a bachelor's degree or more education is really protective. And then in midlife, there are a lot of risk factors, things like hearing loss. That we found out that untreated hearing loss accounts for 8% of risk of Alzheimer's disease, dementia, which is huge. Inactivity, brain injury, diabetes, smoking, all of these things. And then if we fast forward to late life in blue, social isolation, this keeps on coming up. And it's one of the reasons why I love speaking with community groups like this one, because you guys are supporting each other and getting your education and clearly not being isolated, but being isolated is a huge problem. Air pollution and visual loss. So when we add all of these things up, it's 45%. They've done similar studies like in Brazil and places like that, where it's even bigger because they have more, they have less conveniences available to them. So the Brazil study, I think for women specifically, they stratified by men and women, it was 56% in Brazil. So anyway, the bottom line here is there are things we can do to improve our brain health at any point. Early life, that's more of a policy thing, but midlife and late life, those are things that we can do. So this is from the AARP, and they talk about the 6 pillars of brain health, things that you can do to help your cognitive trajectory. And I'm going to focus today on these 3. One is eating, one is sleeping, and one is exercise. Now, sleep is a little bit controversial. It didn't get into the Lancet Commission, and a lot of us who do sleep research are very mad about that because we think it's really, really important. And I suspect it'll get into the next iteration because there's been a lot of scientific discussion since then. But the AARP recognizes sleep as being important, as well as eating and exercising. So let's talk a little bit about physical activity. So I love showing these pictures of what happens when you show the blood vessels in the brain. I think none of us really appreciate how much blood there is in our brains. So, I think of this as a big tree, and we've got the trunk and then the branches and going through to the twigs. Our brains are full of blood vessels. That's how our brain gets its energy, its oxygen, how it gets rid of a lot of the gunk that it builds up and doesn't need anymore. And whatever is good for the heart, so keeps that blood pumping and circulating, is good for our brain. And we know now that vascular risk factors, things that are bad for our heart, actually promote Alzheimer's disease. So physical activity, it helps to build new brain cells. It relieves anxiety and depression, which are risk factors for Alzheimer's, and it decreases inflammation. So what type of exercise should you be doing and how much? And there's a lot of different science on this. I could do a whole 2-hour lecture just on this. But we know that aerobic exercise is probably particularly brain healthy just because it does get things pumping. But we also know that strength building and balance exercises should supplement those. There's even some interesting data that came out recently about stretching that was suggesting it's positive. So I tell people, do what you enjoy and what you're going to stick with, and there's not a one-size-fits-all option. So moving is just really important, and I think we all know that, but some people of course have physical limitations, and I'm showing some aqua aerobics here, doing things that are safe for you and that you're going to stick with and keep going and make it a habit. This is a study that I love. It's an oldie but a goodie from 2011 showing that when they randomized sedentary adults, so people who sit a lot of the time, into groups who were sort of pushed into going on a brisk walking regimen or a stretching regimen. In this study, they were looking specifically at the hippocampus. And that's part of the brain that is really important in laying down new memories. It's one of the parts of the brain that tau attacks first in the Alzheimer's process. And they actually showed that the brisk walkers grew their hippocampus. So these are older adults who were going from being sedentary to being really, really active. And in this study, the hippocampus specifically expanded. So, it's never too late. And even studies where we see people who already have some amyloid in their brain and things like that, when people make these changes, we're seeing really encouraging results. Nutrition, of course, is incredibly important. So the brain is this incredibly energy demanding organ. We do not want to starve our brains by any means. But what kind of food are we fueling it with? So the best evidence, the strongest evidence in the literature, it comes from a Mediterranean diet or something like it. So lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, fish, and nuts and things like that, and then less dairy and less meat and less sweets. So I think the chef, I was looking at people's plates tonight, it looked like a very brain healthy dinner. So we should all eat at Viewpoint more often, clearly. But these foods have antioxidant effects. They're very helpful to the brain. And you've all heard Eat the Rainbow. I think when I come and talk to people in Del Mar or La Jolla, I'm preaching to the converted here. I think a lot of us live very, very healthy lifestyles, but keep doing it. It's good for your brain. And this study from Spain actually showed that adapting from a sort of regular diet to a stronger Mediterranean diet, especially one with extra virgin olive oil, actually showed improvements in cognition after just 4 years. So again, showing that it's never too late and making these changes is super important. A lot of these things don't affect men and women the same. So looking at diets, men and women do have different dietary requirements, and sex hormones influence our body fat in a large way. So women tend to have more fat storage. Carb burning in women favors a diet of good carbs over bad fats, whereas men tend to have more lean muscle mass, where they need more calories in general, and those healthy fats and proteins might be more important. So, you might not want exactly the same food as your partner, and that's okay. And I always think like fueling up is going to be really, really important. Some data that I'm not showing today, but that I'm very excited about, is showing that actually in men, being overweight is really bad news for Alzheimer's risk. For women, it might actually be protective. So after we get to a certain point, having a little bit more fat actually creates estrogens, which can be protective. So yeah, don't go on a diet. Eat good food and lots of it, especially if you're a woman. So I'm going to talk about sleep because I'm a little bit of a sleep nerd. So sleep is really important for learning and memory. So if you have a good night's sleep, you actually consolidate your memories from that day. The sleep is the time where your brain, that hippocampus again, sets that memory, and you remember it better the next day. And they've done a ton of studies, often with young undergrads, where they deprive them of sleep overnight and then they don't pass the test the next day. So we need to do it, and more so as we get older. During the night, there's this whole new system in the brain, which has just been discovered in the last decade, called the glymphatic system, which actually, as the blood pumps through the brain at night, it's actually clearing certain waste proteins, including amyloid. And that only happens well if you have a good night's sleep. And so not surprisingly, poor sleep is linked with various AD risk factors: depression, obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. And individuals with sleep problems, whether that be sleep apnea or insomnia, have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. So these are the recommendations. 6 hours is the very, very minimum. It's different for everyone, but 8 hours can be ideal. Trying lifestyle changes before going to sleeping pills. And if you are taking sleeping pills, really discuss with your doctor whether or not they're going to affect your cognition. The gold standard for insomnia, not being able to get to sleep or stay asleep, is something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And there are actually really good apps which are available for free, which can teach you tricks to avoid insomnia. And that's the gold standard treatment before getting medication. So sleep is something we should all be prioritizing more. Sleep apnea is really common, and it gets more so in old age. It always used to be thought of as an old man's disease, and it's not. Men and women, and this is where that gender stuff comes in. So men and women suffer from sleep apnea in a different way. Men are more likely to have the loud gasping and snorting if their sleep is interrupted by this obstructions to their airways overnight. Women are more likely to have a more gentle snore, but then wake up with a headache. And that's really non-specific, right? If you're lying in bed with your partner and one of them's snoring loudly, you're obviously going to be able to, that's going to disrupt both partners, and it's going to be a big problem. If someone wakes up with a headache, that's kind of easier to ignore. What we know now is that once women get to the point of menopause, sleep apnea is equally prevalent in men and women, and it becomes more prevalent as both sexes age. And it is associated with a higher risk of dementia. And excitingly, CPAP use, so the gold standard treatment, those masks, actually appear to delay cognitive decline. And there just hasn't been enough research in this area, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of our research in it in a little while. So what doesn't work? And these are sort of generals, and a study just came out today that I was speaking with some of the audience about earlier, which talks about the brain game one. But in general, a lot of the supplements that were being sold do not have good evidence behind them. Prevagen, all of those medications, they're getting in trouble with the FDA all the time. They're over-promising and under-delivering. For the most part, they're not very harmful or harmful at all, except for to your wallet. Brain games or other repetitive sedentary activities. So a lot of people will come into my clinic and ask about crossword puzzles and things like that. The data just doesn't really stand up with those things. There is a study that came out and was on NPR today about Brain HQ, which is a system of activities which have been designed for cognitive rehabilitation by scientists, and they had some pretty encouraging data. So this might not be the same for everything, but for the most part, if you're deciding between sitting and playing games or going for a walk, you know what I'm going to suggest you do, and it's not sitting. So get moving. And this is just one of the many FDA or FTC here charges about that have come to Lumosity, which is one of the companies that sold and overpromised for its program to brain train. So what can we do now? It's never too late to make lifestyle changes that can reduce dementia risk. We would love to tell you more about, and I will be telling you about one of our studies, but if you're interested in getting involved in research, we're always looking for older adults, whether or not they have any kind of diagnosis to play a part in our research. And I don't have time to talk about healthy actions and lifestyles to avoid dementia, which is a whole program. I'm very grumpy because the government shut down just as they were thinking about funding it. But you can ask me about it later if you want to. But I am going to talk to you about a study that we do have ongoing that's funded, thankfully, and it will continue for now. But this is the WIT study, the Women, Inflammation, and Tau study. And this study really came up from this idea that, yes, women have more tau. What else do women have more of? Well, we know that women have a lot more inflammation. So diseases that affect inflammation, migraines, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, all of these inflammatory diseases are much more common in women than they are in men. And actually just women experience more neuroinflammation throughout their lives than do men. We know that inflammation kind of paves a path for tau spread. So along with my colleague, Erin Sunderman, we came up with this idea that maybe inflammation is one of the keys to understanding the difference in tau between men and women. And we've been studying that for a few years now. So this is all based on the study I showed you earlier, where women have much more tau in their brain than do men, and sort of understanding why that might be. And we think that inflammation might be creating this pathway for tau. We're not the only people to think that, but we've looked at different data sets where we've shown that women with more inflammation also have worse cognition than do men. So that's this in the bottom here, that the women are in dark and the men are in light. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the predominance of these autoimmune disorders like MS, lupus, are much more common in women. So the evidence is really pointing to inflammation being a problem, potentially a sex-specific problem. So what dampens down inflammation? Well, a lot of these lifestyle factors we've been talking about, so having a healthy diet, getting good sleep, getting enough exercise, they all have an effect on inflammation. So Erin and I decided that we were going to recruit women and measure how well they sleep, what they eat, and how active they are, measure their tau, take out a little bit of the cerebrospinal fluid so we can look at how much inflammation that they have in their brain, and see how these things all gel together. This is an ongoing study, and Ella is the coordinator. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing. We're studying women. We started during the pandemic, which was not a great time to start trying to do these things, but that's how it worked out. But it's ongoing. We have about 80 women in the study now. We need about another 40. And the women come in and then they go through a battery of tests and they come back 2 years later. Most of the data collection takes place right here at UCSD in La Jolla. And then we also have a site in Sorrento Valley, which is very close by, where we do our tau PET scans. And thanks to you all, this is a taxpayer-funded study. We're funded by the National Institute on Aging. And our inclusion criteria, so who do we want in the study? We want women who are at least 65, who do not have a formal dementia diagnosis, and who have some elevated risk for Alzheimer's disease. We look at genetics, we also look at family history, and of course, age. And then we screen people, and if they meet our criteria, they're invited to come to the study. We do a lumbar puncture, so we're very grateful to our ladies because that's not the most fun piece. But from that, we call it liquid gold. It's really amazing. We can look at inflammation as it relates to inflammation in the brain directly. We also can look at amyloid and tau. We also look at that in blood and other ways now. We look at their blood. We look at their sex hormones, both in their cerebrospinal fluid and the blood. And we work with a lab in Boston who can detect very low levels. And we're getting some really, really cool findings of how sex hormones are interacting with diet, which again, I don't have time to talk about, but it's really exciting stuff. We look at insulin resistance. We look at activity, how physically they wear for 1 week an activity device, kind of like a Fitbit, so we can look at how active they are. We also ask them a ton of questions. We have them do a home sleep test, which involves wearing a little cannula and another little gadget just overnight for 1 night. And then we do brain imaging. We do an MRI and PET to look at tau in the brain and a whole bunch of cognitive tests. So we're very, very grateful to the women who go through all of this. And some of the benefits of participating, we tell people their sleep apnea results, we tell them their insulin results, and overall how well they do cognitively. They also get a free scan of their brain at both visits and a little bit of money to help compensate for the time. And of course, we hope that one of the big drivers for people being in this study is this contribution to science. So I want to show you some of our trainees' work. And I'm really going to base this on sleep because some of the early findings that I've seen in the sleep have been really surprising and interesting. The surprising finding to me was that these women come in and they do these home sleep tests, and we're based here in La Jolla. So a lot of the women in the study tend to be healthy and slim and very active, but more than 70% of the women in the study found out that they had sleep apnea because they were in the study, and almost none of them were aware ahead of time. So, and I was surprised. I thought it was going to be 30-40% max, but 70% is a really high number. And then the sleep data is correlating really strongly with the amount of tau in their brain. So this is work by one of our graduate students, Kitty, and she's looking at the severity of sleep apnea based on how much tau someone has and how much memory they have. And what we find is that the amount of apnea in their brain, how poor the brain is at saturating oxygen during the night, correlates really strongly with how much tau they have in the brain. And that, of course, predicts how well they do on memory tests. And so we see in the opposite, of course, is also true, where less apnea is related to less tau. So we think that monitoring sleep health is really important in brain health and risk of AD. And this is another trainee, Dr. Jordan Stiver, who's off to the Mayo Clinic for his first faculty position in a couple of weeks. And he found something else that was very interesting, just looking at the amount of sleep that women are getting in the study. And what he found, there's two graphs here. The top one is showing that having more sleep is associated with less tau, even if you have high genetic risk. So apolipoprotein E4 is a risk factor, even in women. So in the green line there, that's high total sleep time, and whether they are negative or positive on the genetic risk factor. And having high sleep time keeps you low tau, whereas if you have low sleep time, so not enough sleep, and the genetic risk factor, you have a lot of tau. And he sees that as well when he looks at memory, where having more tau and good sleep, a lot of sleep, is actually protective for your memory. So if anything else, I hope I'm not putting you to sleep right now, but when you go home, have a really good night's sleep tonight, because it's protecting you even if you're at high risk. So I'm going to wrap up there. I want to thank the team, my partner in crime, Erin Sunderman. We do a lot of research together. She's in DC right now doing fancy stuff, but otherwise she'd be here. Nadine is our program manager, and Ella is right here working hard as always. And we have a huge team who work with us. So we're very grateful. And I just did want to put a plug. We are looking for more women in WITS, and that's on this side. And we also have some data on the table about that, some sheets. And there's also, if anyone isn't interested in WITS but is interested in other studies, we have our Shiley Marcos ADRC, Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. I also have a hat there, and we're very interested in people participating, getting involved. So yeah, I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening, and happy to answer. I think we have questions on cards. Is that right? That's how I've been instructed. I'll leave that one up. So. Oh, I don't know. You can ask them. I did have one question just while Ella's getting organized. There was one question that came up before, which is if Alzheimer's disease affects families, it doesn't just affect individuals, and where's a good place to get information about that? One of my favorites is the Alzheimer's Association. They have really great information on their website. They have local chapters. And the ADRC, we also have support groups. You don't have to be involved in our research to be involved in our support groups, both for caregivers and people who are affected by the disease directly. So I'm a big believer in support groups. If you're going through this, whether it's something that you have a diagnosis yourself or you're caring for someone who does, not feeling alone can make a huge difference. So, and peer support. Okay, Ella.
Right.
She's got all the power now.
Oh boy. Can you hear me? Oh yeah, I can hear me. All right. The first question we have is regarding genotyping. Do you recommend the ApoE genotype blood test, and how heavily would you rely on those results?
Oh, that's a good question. So of course we can all do genotyping now, 23andMe and all of that. I think it's a really complicated question. So both my grandmothers had Alzheimer's disease. My dad had Alzheimer's disease. I'm just going with I've probably got it at this point, but I don't want to know. I feel like I would get very anxious about that. But that's a very, very personal question. I have a good friend who's had hearing loss her whole life, and she was worried about it, and she went and got the tests, and it was negative, and now she feels super reassured. So I think it's something that you need, and there's a really good website that I'm totally blanking on, which helps you like go through decision-making questions. But I think it's very, very personal, whether or not you want to do that. Another thing with all of our data on ApoE4 is really based on people who are white, Northern European ancestry. So if I tell people if they are not of that category, for example, in Africa, the ApoE4 gene is much more prevalent, it's much more common, and it carries a different risk weighting. So there's a lot of nuance there. But I think it's very individual. And what are you going to do with that information? You should still be sleeping really well and exercising and eating a good diet. So ask yourself whether or not you're going to change anything, or is it just going to be another stressor?
Great answer.
Thank you.
All right. This next question, has anyone found a link between stressors of caregiving for Alzheimer's disease and later Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, in addition to other risk factors?
Oh, that's a good question. So caregiving for anyone with any disease is incredibly stressful. I don't know what the data says, but anecdotally, I've definitely seen it where somebody has come to the end of their caregiving period, a loved one has died, and then suddenly they are found to have a lot more cognitive compromise. I think a lot of times people kind of keep things together when they're taking care of someone and they aren't able to take care of themselves. Getting good sleep when you're caring for someone with an end-of-life disease is no joke. So, and I think it probably does accumulate. And again, another plug for support groups and making sure that you lean on others as much as possible.
Thank you. This next question, if a person with hearing loss has a hearing aid, does this negate the risk factor?
So that's such a good question. I have a lovely colleague at UCSD, Megan Fitzhugh, who's studying just this. And I asked her that question. And she was like, I don't know what the research is showing. Some is showing yes, and some is showing no. I suspect it helps. If you get a hearing aid that works and that you wear, so many people have a hearing aid, but they don't wear it. And the science, of course, is so exciting now with the Bluetooth technology and linking it up with your phone so that you can control where you're listening. So I think the science, not based on Dr. Fitzhugh's input, she's the expert, is not complete at this point. But I think if you're not listening and you're not picking up, you probably withdraw. And then all of these risk factors are related to each other, right? So when we talk about loneliness and social isolation, if you're not able to engage in a conversation and keep up because you can't hear, you're more likely to not go out as much and isolate. So I think get the hearing aid and wear it. And if that hearing aid doesn't work, go get a different kind.
Get your hearing checked. That's the baseline.
Yeah.
All right. Moving more into medications. Are there any reliable medications yet?
So the medications that are FDA approved right now for Alzheimer's disease are Aricept or donepezil, which has been on the market for a long time, which slows down some of the symptoms and kind of activates the brain. And then the disease-modifying medications are lecanemab or Leqembi and donanemab or Kisunla, I think it's called, the brand name, which has just come out. And those last two are exciting because they're taking amyloid out of the brain. They have only been studied on symptomatic patients, although they are being studied right now on those preclinical patients. And I think we're all kind of waiting with bated breath and hope that that data will be really exciting, because that would be really revolutionary if we can get the amyloid out before it starts causing the tau to spread and the cognitive problems. Leqembi and lecanemab and donanemab are, again, a very personal decision. They come with risk factors, which are not insignificant. There's a lot of, because of the risk factors, you have to have a lot of brain imaging, and you need to be under quite frequent care with your doctor, which means appointments and going back and forth and all of that. So I really encourage people to talk to their doctors about what they're getting involved with and what the general benefit is. It doesn't undo cognitive decline, it slows down future cognitive decline. And for some people, they're saying that they're seeing a lot of change, and other people are saying less so. So I think it's scientifically exciting, and in practice, it kind of depends on the patient and their particular setup. Long, complicated answer. Sorry.
No, that was great. Continuing medications. What about GLP-1 agonists?
Ooh,
What about those
yeah.
medications? Are they useful?
It's a good one. So these are these new medications for diabetes and weight loss, and they're kind of taking the world by storm. There are 2 clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease that are going to be read out. The results are going to come out in the next few months that have been looking at whether or not these medications help prevent Alzheimer's disease or the brain changes that happen in Alzheimer's disease. Early findings from those studies suggested there was less shrinkage of the hippocampus, which is exciting. Of course, if you have diabetes, prediabetes, that is a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So one of the questions will be, well, is it a direct GLP-1 to Alzheimer's disease finding, or is it that GLP-1 is improving the blood sugar, which is reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease? I think that we will know in a few months, and we don't know yet. One of those medications, tirzepatide, has recently been FDA approved based on work at UCSD for sleep apnea, because it improved that. So there's all these different mechanisms by which, GLP-1 agonists might help Alzheimer's disease. But we don't know. And I'm curious because we are seeing this kind of protective effect of being a bit heavier in women. So I'm a little concerned about whether or not we're going to see those GLP-1 agonist results in men and women separately, because I think that'll be very important as well. But definitely having prediabetes, diabetes is not good for your brain. So
Thank you. This question's kind of heading into the sleep. I'm not familiar with the study, but there was a Benadryl study in reference to the recent Benadryl Harvard study. Sorry. Do you think there may be a link to increased dementia with Benadryl?
Yeah. So there's a lot of medications, including Benadryl, that affect your cholinergic system. So that medication we talked about earlier, donepezil, that activates your cholinergic system. But a lot of medications that people take actually suppress it. And Benadryl is one of those. So, and then other ones are things that affect overactive bladder sometimes. And when patients come to us in our clinic, we have the UCSD Center for Brain Health and Memory Disorders. One of the questions that any of the doctors, whether it's geriatrician, myself, neurologist, whoever it's going to be, they're going to look really closely at your medications, because there are a lot of medications that we take that have either a little or a big effect on that system. And it can, my side story, my grandfather, who did not have dementia, was having some nausea and dizziness, and he got a medication called scopolamine, and which is actually used in rat studies to kind of look at dementia. And it was incredible. He went from being very, very sharp 90-year-old man to having hallucinations, not being able to remember anything. We realized, actually, my husband, who's a neurologist, realized he was on this medication and was like, no, we're not taking that one anymore. And they took it off, and he was back right as rain. So the medications can have, that's a very extreme example. He should not have been given that medication. But yeah, medications can have a big effect. Benadryl, there are alternatives, right? Benadryl is an older medication used for allergies a lot. Some people do use it to help them sleep. Not a good idea if you're an older adult, but always discuss these. If you are changing out medications or taking a new medication, always discuss it with pharmacists, medical professionals.
Thank you. Are sugar-free menthol cough drops hazardous to health while sleeping? I take these for sleep. Are they good for keeping sleep apnea at bay?
Ooh, I don't know.
I'm speaking as if I'm the person, not me. This isn't my question. Although I'm interested.
That is not something that I'm that familiar with. So I can't answer that one.
No worries. This question, do different sleep stages, do we know, affect the quality of benefit? And can we increase REM, for example?
Right. That's a really good question. That would be a really good question for one of the sleep docs. I know that, yes, you need to have more good quality sleep, and that's one of the things that sleep apnea or sleep fragmentation disrupt. And that's another way that men and women differ just in their basic sleep architecture. So not something that I can answer. And I know that the gadgets that we all use, I use my Apple Watch, and the sleep docs tell me it's not very good at the different sleep stages. So just passing that along.
All right. I've got some fun ones for us.
Okay.
What are the
And
pros and
We
cons?
should check on time. Are we
Oh,
okay
time.
to keep going with this? I'm not
We have
sure.
7
Okay.
more minutes?
I'll keep going. So
Yeah,
someone
we
needs
can
to
go
stop me.
forever.
Dan says two more. Two more questions.
2 more? Okay.
Okay.
These are good ones.
Okay.
Could menopause cause the spike in tau?
So menopause, that's such a good question. So menopause is part of the problem for sure. So Lisa Mosconi, who's working in New York, has done these really interesting studies on women who undergo hysterectomy with oophorectomy, so taking out their eggs in their womb. And she's looked at the brain before and then afterwards. And what happens is very Alzheimer's-like if the hormones aren't replaced. And then there's a slow and steady recovery. So we know that the brain is full of estrogen receptors, and estrogen is very protective for the brain. We know that women who have later menopause are somewhat more protected than women who have earlier menopause. And we know that certain HRTs, if taken, hormone replacement therapies, if taken at the right time, can be protective for brain health. So yes, menopause is a problem because after menopause, estrogen sort of falls off a cliff. What we're trying to figure out, and this is Dr. Sunderman's work, which is so interesting, is kind of what we can do about that and what the best way to do that with the lowest risk. And yeah, I can prattle on, but I will leave it there.
Great. All right. Our last question is regarding diet in general. Are there things we use daily or consume that may contain substances that may predispose someone to Alzheimer's disease, such as alcohol use?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, alcohol's a tough one. Historically, the data has been kind of all over the place with alcohol. I think we're being pushed more towards alcohol is generally a bad thing for our health in general, including our Alzheimer's risk. I tell people that, you have to balance all of these things, right? It has to be doing what you enjoy, and if having a glass of wine with friends is something that you really enjoy and it's not just a habit and you're doing it for just to be one of the team or something, then you should keep doing it if it's worth it for you. But I think the data is really out there. It's really confounded. So people who drink alcohol, especially wine, tend to be better off and have more other advantages, which we know can be beneficial for brain health. And then wine is part of the Mediterranean diet, right? So I think the data's questionable, but I think a few years ago, I think we were more like, yeah, moderate drinking's fine. But I think those days might be numbered, sadly.
All right. Those are all the questions, all the time we have. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banks, for just an exciting lecture and the thoughts that all of us are left with. Let's thank her one more time. And that's it for this